Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. And this time, we're gonna tackle a pretty heavy topic. But before we get into all that, I always like to start off with a little bit of humor, right?
Absolutely.
So, did you hear about the invisible man who turned down a job offer?
Oh, no, I haven't.
He said he just couldn't see himself doing it.
That's pretty good. That's a good one.
All right, well, with that out of the way, let's get down to business. I'm Hari.
And I'm Kimi.
And we're here to take a deep dive into a particularly tragic event from the Falklands War. We're going to be examining the friendly fire incident that resulted in the downing of a British Army Gazelle helicopter, serial number XX377. It happened on June 6, 1982, near a place called Pleasant Peak.
That's right. And we have some really fascinating sources for this one that go into incredible detail about the incident itself, the immediate aftermath, the investigations that followed, and, the broader context of the war.
Yeah, and our goal today is to really unpack all of that information. We want to understand what happened, why it happened, and what the long-term consequences were.
Exactly. And there are definitely some less widely known aspects of this story that I think our listeners will find really interesting.
Absolutely. So to set the stage, let's rewind a bit and talk about the Falklands War itself.
Right. So just to recap for everyone, the Falklands War started when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982.
And of course, the British, they weren't just going to let that stand. They responded by sending a naval task force all the way down to the South Atlantic to retake the islands.
Yeah, and it was a huge logistical challenge for the British. I mean, they were operating thousands of miles from home.
Absolutely. And one of the most important aspects of that whole operation was, well, it was resupply, right?
Yeah, keeping the troops supplied with everything they needed, food, ammunition, equipment, that was absolutely essential.
Yeah, and helicopters played a critical role in those resupply efforts, particularly the ones that were flying from San Carlos to support the troops who were advancing towards Stanley.
Right. And on the other side of things, the Argentinians were also using aircraft for resupply. They were flying in supplies on their Lockheed C-130 Hercules aircraft, which, caused a lot of concern for the Royal Navy.
Yeah, I mean, they were a real threat, those C-130s.
Hmm.
So on the night of June 5, 1982, HMS Cardiff, a British Type 42 destroyer, was positioned east of the islands.
Right, and their mission that night was twofold. First, they were providing gunfire support for the Royal Marines who were operating ashore.
And second, they were tasked with intercepting any Argentine aircraft that might try to fly over what was called the Bluff Cove gun line, which was located east of the islands.
Exactly. And, it's interesting to note that just a few nights prior to this incident, Cardiff had actually attempted, unsuccessfully, to shoot down some Argentine resupply aircraft.
Oh, really?
Yeah, both during their landing approaches and as they were taking off. They just couldn't quite get a lock on them.
Wow, so that already paints a picture of a very tense environment, a lot of pressure on the crew of the Cardiff.
Definitely. And now let's bring the Gazelle helicopter into the picture, the one with the serial number XX377.
Right, so the Gazelle was on a seemingly routine mission. They were tasked with transporting personnel and equipment to a radio rebroadcast station that had been set up on the top of Pleasant Peak.
Yeah, and this rebroadcast station was crucial because it was supposed to provide a communication link between the 5th Infantry Brigade headquarters in Darwin and the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, who were located in Fitzroy.
And the pilot of the Gazelle was Staff Sergeant Christopher Griffin.
Right, an experienced pilot.
Yeah, he'd been flying for a while. And the flight from Goose Green, where they took off from, to Pleasant Peak was only supposed to take about 10 minutes.
A short hop, really.
Before heading to Pleasant Peak, though, the Gazelle crew flew to Darwin to pick up some replacement equipment.
They also picked up 2 passengers there. Major Michael Forge, who was the commander of 205 Signal Squadron, and Staff Sergeant John Baker, who was also from the same squadron.
So you've got an experienced pilot, a routine mission, essential personnel, and equipment on board. It seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, on the surface, it does. But, of course, this was a war zone, and things could change very quickly. And in this case, they did.
So at approximately 2:00 a.m. local time, the radar operators on HMS Cardiff picked up a contact on their screens. It was the Gazelle, and it was approaching from about 25 nautical miles away.
And here's the crucial detail. The helicopter's IFF transponder, which stands for Identification Friend or Foe, was turned off.
And that's going to be a problem, isn't it?
It certainly was. Because without that IFF signal, the crew on the Cardiff had no way of knowing that this was a friendly aircraft. And to make matters worse, they saw that the contact was heading towards Stanley.
So they assumed it was an enemy aircraft.
Exactly. And based on its speed and trajectory, they thought it was either a Hercules on a resupply mission or possibly even a Pucará ground attack aircraft.
And tragically, they acted on that assumption.
Yeah. Cardiff fired 2 Sea Dart missiles. The first one missed, but the second one struck the Gazelle.
Oh, man. I can only imagine the chaos and confusion in the moments after that happened.
Yeah, it was a chaotic scene. The 5th Infantry Brigade immediately lost radio contact with the helicopter, and personnel who were stationed at the rebroadcast station on Pleasant Peak actually witnessed the explosion.
Wow. And initially, I'm guessing everyone thought it was enemy action.
Oh, absolutely. They thought the Argentinians were attacking. In fact, Gurkha patrols were sent out to search for the enemy, and there was even a near miss involving another potential friendly fire incident when those patrols came across the personnel who were manning the Pleasant Peak station.
It's incredible how quickly these situations can escalate. And it wasn't until daybreak that a proper search could be conducted.
Yeah. And when they finally found the wreckage of the Gazelle, it was a devastating discovery. The bodies of the 4 British servicemen were recovered. They were the first fatalities suffered by the 5th Infantry Brigade during the entire conflict.
So naturally, suspicion immediately fell on HMS Cardiff.
Right. And later that same day, Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward issued what's known as a weapons-tight order.
What does that mean exactly?
Essentially, it meant that ships were only allowed to engage aerial contacts if they could be positively identified as hostile. They were especially cautious about anything flying at low speed and low altitude over East Falkland.
So they were trying to prevent another tragedy like this from happening.
Exactly. But, one thing that's not as well known about this incident is that there was actually a lot of uncertainty in the immediate aftermath about what exactly had happened to the helicopter.
Really?
Yeah, the initial inspection of the wreckage didn't provide conclusive evidence of what had caused the crash.
So what did they tell the families of the victims?
Well, at the time, the official statement was that the helicopter had been lost in action. The Ministry of Defense said that they didn't want to cause any further distress to the families until they had a better understanding of what had happened.
I can understand that, I suppose. But it must have been agonizing for the families not knowing exactly what had happened to their loved ones.
Absolutely. And to make matters even more confusing, the initial scientific tests that were done on missile fragments that were recovered from the crash site, those tests were inconclusive as well.
Really? Even though they found a Sea Dart missile casing nearby?
Yeah, they did find a casing, but it was like several hundred yards away from the main wreckage, so it wasn't clear if it was actually related to the incident.
Wow, so it was all very murky, very unclear in those early days.
It was. And because of that uncertainty, and also because they didn't want to add to the family's grief, there was a significant delay before a formal inquiry was launched.
How long did it take?
It wasn't until 4 years later, in 1986, that the Board of Inquiry was finally convened.
4 years? That's a long time to wait for answers.
It is. But when the Board of Inquiry did finally meet, they definitively concluded that the deaths of the 4 servicemen were a result of friendly fire.
So it was confirmed. But what about accountability? Did they find anyone to blame for what happened?
Well, interestingly, despite reaching that conclusion about the friendly fire, the Board of Inquiry specifically recommended that neither negligence nor blame should be attributed to any individual.
So they weren't blaming anyone specifically, but they must have identified some contributing factors, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. There were several critical systemic issues that came to light. One of the biggest ones was the lack of communication between the Army and the Navy.
How so?
Well, for starters, the 5th Infantry Brigade hadn't informed the naval forces about the Gazelle's flight path because they considered it to be a routine operation within their own area of responsibility.
And on the other hand, the Naval Command hadn't told the Army that Cardiff had repositioned itself in order to set up an ambush for any Argentine aircraft that might be flying in that area.
Exactly. So you had these 2 units operating in close proximity, but they weren't talking to each other.
A recipe for disaster, really.
It was. And then, to make matters worse, the Gazelle's IFF transponder was switched off because it was known to interfere with the Army's Rapier anti-aircraft missile system.
So they knew there was a problem with the IFF, but they were still flying without it.
Yeah, which meant that there was no way for the Navy to electronically verify that the Gazelle was a friendly aircraft.
It's tragic how all of these factors combined to create this perfect storm, leading to the loss of those 4 men.
It truly is.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that this tragedy did lead to some significant changes in the way the British military operates.
Such as?
Well, the Board of Inquiry recommended that NATO procedures for amphibious warfare and naval gunfire support should be revised. They specifically wanted to highlight the risks posed by a ship's missile engagement zone extending over land areas.
So basically, they wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of the potential dangers.
Exactly. And there was also a much greater emphasis on joint warfare training after this incident, with exercises like Exercise Purple Warrior becoming more prominent.
And those exercises were designed to improve coordination between the different branches of the military.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page, that they were communicating effectively, and that they understood each other's capabilities and limitations.
And what about the Permanent Joint Headquarters?
Right, so the Permanent Joint Headquarters was established in response to this incident as well. The idea was to prevent the kind of ad hoc, reactive operational control that had characterized some previous deployments.
So more centralized planning and coordination.
Exactly. And crucially, IFF transponders were retrofitted to all relevant Army Air Corps and Royal Marine helicopters. They also fixed the technical issue that was causing the interference with the Rapier system.
So they addressed those key technological and procedural shortcomings.
They did. And the responsibilities of Naval Gunfire Support Liaison officers were also expanded. They were now required to have a much better understanding of air defense considerations when operating in coastal environments.
So a lot of lessons were learned, a lot of changes were made. But sadly, it took a tragedy like this to make those changes happen.
That's true. And to remember those who were lost in this incident, a memorial cross was erected on Pleasant Peak at the crash site.
That's fitting.
Yeah, and the surviving members of 205 Signal Squadron, the unit that Major Forge and Staff Sergeant Baker belonged to, they went back to the site and painted the number 205 in huge numerals, about 40 meters wide, right there at the crash site.
It's a powerful tribute to their fallen comrades, and it's a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of learning from our mistakes.
Absolutely. And, looking back on this incident, it really highlights the importance of clear and consistent communication, especially in high-pressure situations.
No doubt about it. When communication breaks down, especially in a war zone, the consequences can be devastating.
And this incident also underscores the importance of technology like IFF, which can help to prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening.
It's a sobering reminder of the complexities of war and the importance of constantly striving to improve our procedures and our technology to minimize the risk of friendly fire incidents.
Well said, Hari. Well said.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a very difficult and important topic.
We appreciate you being here.
Until next time, take care.